In 1775, Britain seemed like the dominant power in North America. 8 years later, they lost their most valuable colonies as the glorious US of A declared their independence. In the following centuries, the new republic starts to expand across the continent, eventually even becoming the most powerful nation in the entire world. How did this happen? Well, a bunch of relatively disorganized, angry colonists started a rebellion against what was arguably the most powerful empire in the world at the time. It seemed like a doomed plan, but through good leadership and some serious help from the French, the colonists emerged victorious and became an independent state. But what if this changed? Independence was not a goal from the start. The colonies, angered about British taxes without representation, simply demanded the abolishment of said taxes and some more autonomy. Or, alternatively, they wanted representation in the British Parliament, though, due to travel time, this wasn't really feasible at the time. Despite these mild initial demands, preventing the revolution is still rather tricky. Britain only became interested in negotiating after losing a couple of military engagements. But also, the moment the Americans started to be successful militarily, momentum started to swing to demand full independence. This is the fundamental issue with preventing the American Revolution. Before American victories, Britain has no reason to let go of what they consider to be their rightful colonies. After American victories, Britain may be interested in compromising, but the emboldened Americans believe in full independence. So, there are two ways of reasonably making this happen. Both not fully realistic, but they may be plausible. In the first one, after winning some initial military engagements, Britain still decides that it's not worth fighting a war over and offers to negotiate. The second option is as the colonies begin to mount serious resistance, the British realize that they should cut their losses, fearing French intervention and a large escalation of the conflict. Now this second option would require some insane hindsight from the British, but it would also allow us a much more stable British North America than if we allow bullets to be fired, and the Brits to crush the Americans militarily. So, if we assume that, following initial tensions over taxes, like the Boston Tea Party and even the Boston Massacre, Britain begins meeting with the colonies to discuss autonomy. Most taxes are repealed, with only a few remaining to contribute to imperial defense. Beyond that, the British start retreating from interfering in the affairs of the 13 colonies, as the basis was laid for a dominion system like we'd later see with Canada, Australia, and such. So, do we now have a massive, united American dominion, which will slowly take over all of British North America, and with British backing, maybe taking over everything? Well, not quite. The uniqueness in this scenario is that there is no American identity, at least not yet. Such a thing was forged in the Revolutionary Wars and reinforced during the Civil War. But rather than negotiate with a united coalition of states, Britain, very deliberately, discusses with each colony individually, even playing the different colonies against each other to a certain extent. We would very likely see a split happen, where the northern states remain closer to Britain and their trading interests, while the south may push for even greater autonomy. Either way, in the short term, little too radical has been changed. Even before, the colonies had held significant autonomy. These would now have just become enshrined and reinforced. Things seem calm. That is, until conflict erupts over settlers moving west. Britain had in 1763 decided that this border you see now has to be the furthest extent for the settlers of the 13 colonies. The land further west would be designated as native reservations. This decision by Britain would later be repealed, but it is still a significant point of contention, especially when it becomes very clear that Britain cannot stop their settlers from moving west. What I imagine to happen is a back and forth, something like this, between the colonies and Britain. Britain declares some line or another is the border for the colonies. The colonists, quite simply, would move there anyway, forcing the expansion of pre-existing colonies and perhaps even the creation of new ones. The British would oversee this process and they would then say, okay, this is the new border of settlement. The settlers, of course, would continue to move west anyways. The exact way that this plays out is hard to tell. so I can't be very specific about anything. But fact is that the colonies have such a local population advantage, Britain cannot hope to contain them to the east coast. Still, Britain wouldn't be fully unsuccessful. I can imagine a couple of major native reservations being created and upheld by the British. Of course, most of the land still gets eaten up by the hungry colonists, but the natives have already gotten a far better deal than in our timeline. But the British have also started a precedent for colonial autonomy. The autonomy that was allowed to the 13 colonies would soon be demanded by Canada too, and they would likely get it. With this, a rather major change has taken place. There is no notion of an America and a Canada. There is little difference between the dominions in modern Canada or those in what we know as America. In fact, people from the Canadian dominions will likely grow closer to the northern 13 states than the northern 13 states will be to the south. This fact may become important later. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all my videos, consider doing so. Thank you. Now this same precedent can also be applied to other British settler colonies, but with less speed. Australia especially is an interesting case. They were settled and claimed by the British for a very specific reason. The British had an interesting way of dealing with criminals, and considered building more jails to be too costly. So, what did Britain do with them? They moved them to America. Now in our timeline, the system kind of broke down when the Americans achieved independence. But British jails were still overflowing, literally. So the British started housing criminals on ships instead, and something had to be done. That is where Australia came into play, founded quite literally for the explicit purpose of housing British convicts. But now that the Americas are still a part of Britain and convicts can be brought there, this Australian plan is not necessary. And this can have some profound impacts on Australia. For most European colonizers, Australia's benefits were quite unknown, but few were really interested. For a settler colony, it was way further removed from Europe than the Americas were. I mean, even in our timeline, the Dutch were right across there, dominating Indonesia, yet they still considered it not worth the hassle to go to Australia. Putting the same effort in colonizing the rest of Indonesia, which was already profitable due to the people living there, was a far better idea for them. So realistically, there weren't that many candidates for colonizing Australia. Most states didn't have the population or the resources for such an endeavor, or the naval capacity to defend the area. I see three potential outcomes for Australia. 1. Britain still claims it eventually, and nobody really cares to contest it. Here, we mostly have our Australia, but significantly less populated. Scenario 2. Somewhere down the road, a scramble for Australia carves up the continent, creating a series of weak, sparsely populated states, as the Europeans care more about claiming it for the prestige than for actual settlement. Scenario 3. Pretty much nobody really gets Australia. I mean, at some point, someone will claim it, but very little settlement occurs. And it is mostly just left to the Aboriginals who were already there. Whichever of these it is, the fate of Australia has been thoroughly changed by this development in North America. That moves us to the matter of France, whose entire trajectory is irreversibly changed by the lack of an American Revolution. You see, only a couple of decades before the American Revolution, North America looked like this, with a massive French colony controlling a large part of the continent. But don't get too impressed. Around 100,000 people lived in this entire French section, while the British colonies were growing fast with millions of people. Still, New France represented France's greatest colonial venture, and it was a key region in the rivalry between France and Britain over which of the two was the most powerful nation in Europe. After fighting a massive global conflict over it, which Britain won due to their superior navy, the French colonial empire in North America was completely dismantled, and it seemed affirmed that Britain would have the upper hand in global affairs for the foreseeable future. But France didn't really want to let it go. They hated being second. They just had to get back at Britain somehow. And wouldn't you know, a bunch of angry colonials have just started a revolution against the British. The perfect opportunity for France to break up the British Empire somewhat, which they then did. Good job, France, you've done it. You have weakened your global rival. What's that? Oh, France is completely broke now, and a revolution will soon destroy the French monarchy. Whoops! Upcoming is a chart of French debt. At the start of the century, it starts rising, as France is fighting some pretty major wars. This trend continues, with the War of Austrian Succession increasing debts further. Then we have the 7 Years' War, which caused another major spike. Now are you ready for the American Revolutionary Wars? Bam! This is the extent to which France indebted itself to buy America's independence, doubling their debts within a decade. Now if we zoom in a bit to just the 7 Years' War and the American War of Independence, French debt was actually trending downwards in between these two conflicts. Alright, I'm sorry for the boring charts, so here are some colorful visuals to wake you up again. Now it's difficult to overstate just how important the American Revolution was on France, indirectly leading to the Revolution, the Revolutionary Wars, the rise of Napoleon, and thus the start of what I would consider the modern day. So we have a simple question to ask, which determines the entire future of this scenario. Does the French Revolution still happen? There are many arguments, both for and against. In the against camp, we have debt was trending downwards, the French were attempting to reform, and French revolutionaries aren't inspired by American successes. On the other hand though, reform was attempted before and mostly failed. France was a major power looking for revenge, and another big war seemed likely to spike up debt anyway. And finally, Enlightenment ideals were still taking serious hold in the nation. Personally, I don't think France can completely prevent the revolution. I think they lacked the cunning leadership necessary to make such major reforms. But I will not deny its possibility. If France spends their time to reform state spending, stabilizing the economy, rather than fighting new major wars to get back at Britain, they could get it done. But personally, my money would be in possibility 2. Some form of revolution, or at least major shake-up, happens eventually, but later and potentially weaker. This can come in many forms. It simply happens later, but is mostly the same. It can be a mostly peaceful, but forced transition to a constitutional monarchy. It may be even more violent, etc. But whether it happens, and how, I cannot say for certain. The French Revolution will very likely not happen in the same way. Which makes things far more difficult for this, average height for the time, Corsican. His rise to power wasn't inevitable. In fact, I would ponder that it was quite unlikely. Even a slight delay in the French Revolution can doom Napoleon to simply being a quite skilled local commander, unable to rise the ranks further because he simply lacks the correct birth. And by removing Napoleon, or at least putting his rise into some pretty serious doubt, I lose my ability to go much further in time in this scenario. Still, if you want me to, I have another scenario planned where we can explore both Napoleon rising as well as British North America at the same time. Let me know in the comments if you may be interested in this. But with that said, we will still continue the scenario, but I'll have to be vaguer about certain aspects. For now, it's time for some consolidation. Much like how Canada and Australia were eventually unified over time, we would see the starting dominions consolidate too. An independent Rhode Island Dominion, for example, has little reason to remain separate. The exact form, I don't know, but I'd reckon things like a major New England Dominion, eventually a Southern Dominion, etc. It is even a possibility that over time, all the dominions will unify into one big North American Dominion, which would be a beast of a state. But just how much of North America would the British control? That is another tough matter. Settlers will undoubtedly continue to go west, but where do they stop, assuming they ever do? Personally, I think that the Louisiana Territory would represent the furthest extent of British America. Whether Spain, France, or perhaps even Mexico starts controlling this area, this is such sparsely populated land, it cannot resist the population horde coming from the east. I imagine British North America will come to resemble something like this eventually. But interestingly, even these new borders wouldn't necessarily stop the settlers moving further west. Let's assume it's Mexico that controls these territories. I can very much imagine that a ring of Texases are created, mostly settled by people trying to escape British hegemony in the east, likely founded as some serious slave states. Britain wouldn't try to incorporate these territories in order to not upset Mexico too much, which would ruin their trading relations with the state. British America, meanwhile, would still become extremely wealthy. They have great access to resources, they have a great climate, they have great natural infrastructure, and perhaps most importantly, they have responsible government. They have all the keys to success. Still, compared to our timeline, America is still far weaker. They lack the unity that the US brought, at least until far later. The British are still siphoning profits from the colonies, and most importantly of all, the massive migration into the US is reduced. Rather than moving to the glorious, free, and equal Republic of the United States, allegedly, Europeans would be moving to British colonies. Yuck. Expect migration streams to be much more equaled to Latin America as well. Over time, the American dominions will absolutely still grow more powerful, especially if unified into one massive dominion. But personally, I don't expect that the center of the empire would ever shift from London to Philadelphia. But, and the exact form this takes will depend on how history goes, North America would likely become independent and basically be a supercharged Canada, still becoming one of the most powerful nations on Earth and eventually overtaking their parent state in power. Now, to conclude this video, there is the matter of slavery in the dominions. The debate, as we know it, and the civil war that came with it are completely changed, if not removed. I see two potential routes that the issue can go, but either way, institutional slavery is one of the worst things we as a species have ever done. And during the 19th century, more and more people will start to agree, especially in Europe, and pressure would start to mount to abolish it. Now, it is very possible that just as in our timeline, the South attempts a conflict to preserve it, when it becomes clear that Britain is trying to abolish it. If they try to revolt though, they will very likely get smacked down, as there is no way that the South can compete with the British Empire. Scenario 2 is what I would consider the more likely option. Opposition to abolishment is still very strong in the South, but a mouse is not going to fight a dragon. I imagine, much like in the rest of the British Empire, landowners are essentially bribed, receiving a good amount of money for the release of their slaves. And much like in our timeline, the freed slaves would simply start working on the same plantations, but now, rather than free, they are working for a terrible wage. Still, with some protection and oversight from the British, the worst of the Jim Crow type laws might very well be avoided. By no means is slavery defeated, don't get me wrong, but things are better than after Reconstruction failed in our timeline. In total, by the end of the scenario, we have some far larger, prospering native reservations protected by Britain, as well as a much safer Afro-American community in the southern dominions. Either way, with that, I think I have discussed all that I wanted to say about this scenario for now. Thank you all very much for watching. Consider leaving a like and a comment. If you enjoyed this video, you will probably enjoy one of the ones on the right now. Just a thought. Again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.